Master Chief Silas Vance moved to the edge of the Oregon cliffs to be forgotten. He was a one-armed seal, a weapon with no trigger left to pull. Then he met Titan, a massive black shepherd so traumatized by war he had lost his voice entirely. Two broken warriors, two silent ghosts waiting to fade away. But when a ruthless cartel surrounded their isolated cabin, they learned a fatal lesson. Silence isn't weakness. It's a weapon. How did a cripple and a mute dog become the underworld's worst nightmare? The answer will make you believe in God's perfect timing. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support truly means the world to us, and tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. The rain in the Oregon wilderness didn't fall. It permeated. It hung in the air like a heavy, wet curtain, soaking into the ancient cedars and dripping relentlessly from the moss that clung to the roof of the cabin on the gray cliff. For 3 weeks, the sun hadn't broken through the canopy. The world here was a spectrum of greens and grays, smelling of wet earth, pine needles, and slow decay. It was a place people went to disappear, which was exactly why Silas Vance had chosen it. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of sawdust and stale coffee. Silas sat hunched over a workbench, his breath hitching in his chest. At 62, his face was a map of deep lines carved by salt spray and desert sun, remnants of a life spent in the Navy SEALs. But the most defining feature of Silas Vance wasn't his face, it was the empty space where his right arm used to be. He gripped a small wood carving chisel in his left hand, his offhand. On the table sat a block of cedar, half-formed into the shape of a soaring eagle. It was meant to be majestic, a symbol of power. But under Silas's clumsy, trembling grip, the bird looked grounded, its wings lopsided and broken. He tried to smooth out the curve of the beak, holding his breath to steady his hand. The blade slipped. It gouged a deep, jagged scar across the eagle's face, ruining weeks of work in a single heartbeat. Silas roared, a sound of pure, frustrated rage, and hurled the chisel across the room. It embedded itself in the log wall with a dull thud. He stared at his left hand, hating it for its incompetence, hating the empty sleeve pinned to his shoulder, and hating the silence that rushed back in to fill the room as soon as his shout faded. He wasn't living here. He was rotting, just like the fallen logs outside being slowly consumed by the forest floor. The sound of tires crunching on wet gravel broke his trance. Silas stiffened. He didn't get visitors. He didn't want visitors. He moved to the window, his gait uneven. A muddy Ford pickup truck with the emblem of the Forest Service on the door had pulled up near the porch. The engine cut, and a young man stepped out into the downpour, pulling up the collar of his uniform jacket. It was Lucas, his nephew. The boy had his mother's eyes and a stubbornness that Silas found exhausting. Silas opened the heavy oak door just as Lucas reached the steps. "I didn't order any Girl Scout cookies," Silas grunted, blocking the doorway with his broad frame. "Good to see you too, Uncle Si," Lucas said, wiping rain from his forehead. He didn't smile. There was a tension in his shoulders that Silas recognized, the look of a man carrying bad news or heavy cargo. "I'm not here for a social call. I need a favor." "I'm fresh out of favors." Silas turned to go back inside. "It's not for me," Lucas called out, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "It's for him." He gestured toward the bed of the truck. Silas paused, narrowing his eyes. Inside the metal cage in the truck bed, something moved. It was a shadow, dark and massive. Lucas walked back and unlatched the gate. "Easy now," he murmured. A German shepherd stepped out onto the tailgate. But this wasn't like any dog Silas had ever seen. He was jet black, a DDR working line shepherd, built like a tank but moving with a strange, ghost-like fluidity. His coat was matted with mud, and a jagged scar ran from his ear down to his neck, interrupting the black fur with a line of silver skin. The dog looked at Silas. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't wag his tail. He simply stood there, frozen, staring with amber eyes that held an intelligence and a darkness that made the hair on Silas's neck stand up. "His name is Titan," Lucas said softly, resting a hand on the dog's wet back. Titan didn't flinch, but he didn't lean into the touch either. He was MWD, military working dog, served 2 tours in Afghanistan looking for IEDs. Silas looked at the animal with a flicker of professional recognition. "He looks like he's seen a ghost." "He is a ghost," Lucas corrected. "His handler was killed 2 years ago. Roadside bomb. Titan took the blast wave. Physically, he recovered, but he hasn't made a sound since. Not a bark, not a whine. The vet calls it trauma-induced mutism." Silas scoffed, looking away. "So, he's broken. Just another piece of government property that stopped working." "They were going to put him down, Silas," Lucas said, his voice rising in frustration. "He's too aggressive for a family home, too unpredictable for service. They marked him as discarded equipment. I pulled some strings to get him out, but I can't keep him at the station. I need you to take him." "No," Silas said firmly. "Look at me, Lucas. Do I look like I'm running a rehab center?" He gestured angrily to his empty sleeve. "I can barely take care of myself. I don't need a mute brain-damaged animal watching me struggle." "He doesn't need a rehab center," Lucas shouted back, the rain plastering his hair to his face. "He needs a commander. He needs someone who understands what it's like to survive when everyone else didn't." Silas stepped onto the porch, his face darkening like the storm clouds above. "Get him out of here. I don't want him." "Why?" Lucas challenged, stepping closer. "Because he's dangerous? Or because looking at him is like looking in a mirror?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the humidity. Silas glared at his nephew, his jaw working silently. He wanted to strike him. He wanted to scream. But he looked at Titan again. The dog hadn't moved. He stood in the pouring rain, water streaming off his black coat, completely silent, watching Silas with a stoic acceptance of his fate. He looked like a statue carved from sorrow. "I'm leaving him, Silas," Lucas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He unclipped the leash and tied it to the porch railing. "I'll be back in a week with supplies. If you want to shoot him, that's on you, but I think you know he deserves better." Lucas didn't wait for an answer. He jumped back into the truck, the engine roared to life, and within seconds, taillights faded into the mist. Silas stood alone on the porch. The silence of the forest returned, amplified by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. He looked down at the black dog tied to his railing. Titan looked back, blinking slowly, water dripping from his muzzle. 2 crippled soldiers abandoned by the world they had served, left to rust in the middle of nowhere. "You're wasting your time," Silas muttered to the dog, his voice rough. "There's nothing here for you." Titan didn't answer. He just lay down on the wet wood, resting his chin on his paws, and kept his eyes fixed on the door, as if he had been waiting for this post his entire life. The first 72 hours in the cabin were defined not by conflict, but by a suffocating truce. Titan didn't behave like a dog. He behaved like a haunt. He moved through the cedar hallways with an unnerving silence, his paws absorbing the creak of the floorboards. He never begged for food, never scratched at the door, and never made a sound. Silas found himself looking over his shoulder constantly. He would be sanding a piece of wood in the living room, only to turn and find the black shepherd standing in the doorway, watching him. Those amber eyes were unblinking, devoid of the warmth usually found in a pet, holding instead the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who had seen too much. At night, Silas locked his bedroom door, a habit he told himself was for the dog's safety, though deep down he knew it was for his own peace of mind. He wasn't used to sharing his foxhole. Then the Pacific storm broke. It didn't start gradually. It slammed into the Oregon coast with the violence of a breaching wave. The wind howled through the Douglas firs, screaming like banshees, and the rain lashed against the windows horizontally. But it was the thunder that tore the night apart. To a civilian, the sound was just nature's percussion. But to Master Chief Silas Vance, the low-frequency boom that shook the cabin's foundation wasn't weather. It was mortar fire. The first crack of thunder hit at 2 a.m. Silas woke up gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The darkness of the bedroom wasn't the darkness of his home. It was the darkness of a collapsed tunnel in Kandahar. Another boom shook the walls. Silas scrambled out of bed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold corner of the room. He slid down to the floor, his knees pulling to his chest. Then the pain started. It wasn't in his chest or his head. It was in his right hand. The hand that wasn't there. Phantom limb pain is a cruel trick of the nervous system, a ghost haunting its own machine. It felt as if his missing fingers were being crushed in a vice, burning with invisible fire. Silas gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead, his left hand gripping the stump of his right arm, trying to strangle the pain that didn't exist. "Get a grip, Silas," he hissed into the dark, but his voice was thin and breaking. He was drowning in the memory of the blast. The door handle turned. Silas froze, his eyes wide in the gloom. He had forgotten to lock it. The door pushed open slowly, revealing a silhouette against the flashes of lightning from the hallway window. Titan stepped into the room. Any other dog would have been whining, pacing, or hiding under the bed from the thunder. But Titan was a war dog. Explosions were his office. He didn't look at the window. He looked straight at the man crumbling in the corner. He didn't bark. He didn't run over and lick Silas's face. He moved with a deliberate, tactical precision. Titan walked across the room, his nails clicking softly on the wood, closing the distance between them. Silas flinched as the massive animal approached, his body coiled tight. "Back," he choked out. "Get back." Titan ignored the command. He stepped into Silas's personal space and simply sat down. Then he leaned. He pressed the full weight of his 80-pound muscular frame hard against Silas's left side. He laid his heavy head across Silas's lap, right over the trembling legs, and let out a long, steady exhale. Silas tried to push him away, but his strength was gone. And then, something strange happened. Science calls this phenomenon limbic resonance. It is a biological empathy, a symphony played between two nervous systems. When a human is trapped in the grip of PTSD, the brain's amygdala hijacks the system, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline. The logical part of the brain, the part that understands language and reason, shuts down. That is why words like "calm down" or "you're safe" mean nothing to a soldier in a flashback. They are just noise. But Titan wasn't using words. He was using biology. Dogs, especially those bonded to handlers, have an innate ability to sense the chaotic electromagnetic frequency of a human heart in distress. By pressing his body against Silas, Titan was acting as a biological anchor. His heart rate was slow, steady, and rhythmic, a metronome of calm amidst the chaos. Through that physical contact, Titan was broadcasting a signal of safety directly into Silas's nervous system, bypassing the logic centers and going straight to the primitive brain. It was an energetic recalibration. The dog was essentially saying, "I am here. I am calm. Therefore, the threat is not real." Silas felt the warmth of the dog's fur seeping through his t-shirt. He felt the slow rise and fall of Titan's ribcage against his own. Unconsciously, Silas's breathing began to sync with the dog's. The phantom fire in his missing hand began to cool. The walls of the tunnel faded, replaced by the familiar shadows of his bedroom. The mortar fire turned back into thunder. For the first time in 10 years, the panic didn't end with exhaustion. It ended with connection. Silas slumped back against the wall, his left hand trembling as it moved from his own shoulder to rest on the thick fur of the dog's neck. Titan didn't move away. He stayed anchored, his amber eyes half closed, keeping watch over the man who had tried to send him away. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch, aren't you?" Silas whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. Titan's ear flicked once, acknowledging the voice, but he remained silent. In the roar of the storm, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was the first brick laid in a foundation that would soon become unshakable. The rain softened over the next few days, turning from a deluge into a persistent, misty drizzle that clung to the windows like lace. Inside the cabin on the gray cliff, the sharp edges of hostility began to blur into a routine born of necessity. It started with the food. Silas sat in his armchair by the wood stove, a piece of tough venison jerky in his remaining hand. He tore off a bite, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. Titan lay on the rug a few feet away. The dog wasn't begging. He had too much dignity for that. But his ears were perked, swiveling toward the sound of Silas chewing. He was waiting, not as a pet waits for a treat, but as a subordinate waits for rations. Silas stopped chewing. He looked at the meat, then at the dog. With a grunt that was half annoyance and half resignation, he tore off a generous strip. "Don't get used to it," he muttered, tossing it through the air. Titan caught it with a snap, precise and gentle. He didn't gulp it down. He ate it deliberately, his eyes never leaving Silas. It was a transaction, a sharing of resources between two soldiers stuck behind enemy lines. That afternoon, Silas decided to check the perimeter. He grabbed his walking stick and buttoned his oilskin coat. When he opened the door, Titan was already standing there, waiting to take point. They moved into the dripping forest together. The air smelled of ozone and wet cedar. Silas moved slowly, his boots struggling for purchase on the slick mud, while Titan flowed over the terrain like black water, always staying 5 paces ahead, checking the wind. They reached a dense patch of ferns near the old creek bed. Silas, focused on keeping his balance, didn't see the danger hidden beneath the decaying leaves. It was an old, rusted bear trap, forgotten by some poacher decades ago, its serrated jaws open and waiting. Silas took a step forward. His boot hovered inches above the trigger plate. Suddenly, a heavy weight slammed into his shins. Silas stumbled back, cursing as he nearly fell into the mud. "What the hell are you—" He stopped mid-shout. Titan hadn't attacked him. The dog had body-checked him, pushing him away from the path. Titan stood rigid now, his nose pointing directly at the pile of leaves Silas had almost stepped on. Silas used the tip of his stick to brush the foliage aside. The metal teeth of the trap grinned up at him, rusted but still deadly. If he had stepped there, it would have shattered his ankle. He would have been trapped out here, miles from help, bleeding out in the rain. Silas felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He looked at the dog. Titan didn't bark for praise. He didn't jump up. He simply looked back at Silas, checking to see if the package was secure, then turned his head back to the trail. "Good eye," Silas whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He reached out and rested his hand on the dog's wet shoulder. "Good eye, soldier." It was a small victory, but it shifted the ground beneath them. Silas realized that Titan wasn't just a broken animal needing charity. He was an asset. And for a man who had felt defenseless for so long, having someone watch his six was a feeling he had forgotten he craved. But the true turning point came 3 nights later. The temperature plummeted. A cold front from the Pacific swept in, turning the rain into sleet that rattled against the roof like shrapnel. The cabin grew drafty, the heat from the stove struggling to reach the corners of the room. At 3:00 a.m., the silence of the house was broken. Silas woke up, not to a noise from outside, but from within. He lay still, listening. It was a low, high-pitched keening sound coming from the living room. It was the sound of distress. He threw off his covers and walked into the main room, the floorboards icy beneath his bare feet. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, dying orange glow across the floor. In the center of the rug, Titan was running. The dog was on his side, legs paddling frantically against the air. His lips were pulled back, teeth bared in a silent snarl, and whines were escaping his throat in rhythmic bursts. He was trapped in a nightmare, reliving the explosion, the fire, the loss of the man he loved. Silas stood over him, watching the powerful animal reduced to a trembling puppy. He knew that dream. He knew the smell of burning diesel and the sound of screaming that came with it. He had woken up in his own sweat 1,000 times with the same ghosts chasing him. Most people would have shouted to wake the dog, or maybe clapped their hands. Silas did neither. He understood that you don't startle a soldier who is fighting for his life in his sleep. Instead, Silas turned and walked quietly to the cedar chest at the foot of the stairs. He lifted the heavy lid, the smell of cedar and mothballs wafting up. Reaching inside, he pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket. It was navy blue, with a gold anchor stitched in the corner. It was his service blanket, the one that had kept him warm on carrier decks in the North Atlantic and in transport choppers over the desert. He walked back to the thrashing dog. Slowly, carefully, Silas knelt on his single knee. He shook the blanket out, letting it settle gently over Titan's shaking body. He tucked the corners in, creating a heavy, warm cocoon. The weight of the wool seemed to ground the dog. Titan's paddling slowed. The whining faded into a soft, ragged breath. He didn't wake up, but the nightmare receded, pushed back by the warmth and the scent of the man beside him. Silas didn't leave. He sat there on the floor in the dark, his back against the armchair, his hand resting on the wool-covered mound. He listened to the sleet hitting the window and felt the dog's heartbeat slow down to match the rhythm of the room. "Stay frosty, rookie," Silas whispered into the dark. It was the same thing his commanding officer used to say before a night drop. A warning, a blessing, a promise that you weren't alone. Titan let out a long, deep sigh in his sleep, finally at peace. Silas stayed there until dawn broke, the gray light filtering through the windows to find a one-armed man guarding a mute dog. The cabin was still cold, the storm was still raging outside, but for the first time in years, the emptiness inside the house felt filled. The ice around Silas's heart hadn't just cracked, it had begun to melt. 2 weeks later, the relentless gray sky over Oregon fractured, allowing a rare, pale shaft of sunlight to pierce the canopy. It struck the window of the cabin on the gray cliff, illuminating dancing motes of dust that smelled of fresh cedar shavings. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The heavy, stagnant air of decay was gone, replaced by a quiet, rhythmic focus. Silas sat at his workbench, but he wasn't throwing tools in rage anymore. He was holding a carving knife in his left hand, his offhand. His brow was furrowed in concentration as he shaved a thin curl of wood from the eagle's wing. It was slow work, awkward and demanding, but the bird was no longer lopsided. It had begun to take on a rugged, weathered shape, imperfect, but undeniably alive. Titan lay a few feet away, his massive black head resting on the low walnut cabinet where Silas kept his most painful memory, the shattered mechanical watch of the man who died saving him. The dog wasn't asleep. His ears were swiveled forward, tracking the sound of the knife slicing through wood, acting as a second set of senses for the man working at the table. When the sound of Lucas's truck tires crunched on the gravel outside, Titan didn't bark. He simply stood up, walked to the door, and looked back at Silas. The signal was clear. Friend approaching. Silas didn't jump. He just set the knife down. Lucas stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat, and stopped dead. He looked from the pile of fresh wood shavings on the floor to the eagle, and finally to the dog standing guard by the door. "I didn't think I'd see you holding a chisel again," Lucas said, his voice quiet with surprise. "Had to learn a new grip," Silas grunted, blowing dust off the wood. "Turns out, when you lose your dominant hand, you stop trying to force the wood to do what you want. You have to listen to the grain instead." Lucas walked further into the room, eyeing Titan. The dog watched him, calm but alert, his body blocking the path to Silas until Silas gave a subtle nod. Titan stepped aside, allowing Lucas to pass. "He looks different," Lucas observed. less like a ghost. He's not a ghost, Silas said, reaching out. Titan moved to him, pressing his head against Silas's knee. He's a radar. He doesn't waste energy on noise. Because he can't bark, he listens. He hears things the wind tries to hide. Silas looked down at his own empty sleeve, then at the mute dog. His expression softened, the bitterness that had etched lines into his face for years smoothing out. "There's an old Japanese art," Silas murmured, tracing the scar on Titan's neck. "Kintsugi. When a valuable bowl breaks, they don't throw it away. They don't try to hide the cracks either. They fill them with liquid gold." Lucas leaned against the doorframe, listening. "They believe the piece is more beautiful for having been broken," Silas continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought we were trash, Lucas, discarded equipment. But the damage, it clears the noise. Titan lost his voice, so he developed a sight that misses nothing. I lost my arm, so I learned patience I never had with two hands. We aren't broken, nephew." Silas looked up, his eyes clear and sharp. "We've just been put back together with gold. And the thing about gold-filled cracks? They're stronger than the original clay." It was a profound admission. The man who had wanted to die in this cabin was now finding a reason to endure. The maimed duo had found a synergy that was sharper and more dangerous than any whole soldier. Lucas nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips. But as he looked out the window toward the tree line, the smile faded. The peace in the room felt fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. "I'm glad you found your footing, see?" Lucas said, his tone dropping, losing its warmth. "Because you're going to need it." Silas's head snapped up. Titan's ears pinned back, sensing the shift in the room's tension. "What is it?" Silas asked. "I was patrolling the access road near the National Forest line," Lucas said, his face grim. "I found tire tracks, heavy trucks moving at night, and I found markers carved into the trees." Silas went still. "Grow ops." "Worse," Lucas replied. "Cartel. They're moving product through the park to avoid the highway checkpoints, and I found a spotter's mark on the ridge." He pointed a finger toward the window, toward the cliffs. "Looking right down at this cabin." Silas looked at the window. The rain had started again, blurring the view of the forest. "They know this house is the only vantage point for 5 miles," Lucas warned. "If they want to move a major shipment through the cove, they can't have witnesses. You're not just an old man in the woods to them, Silas. You're an obstacle." Silas looked down at Titan. The dog was staring at the door, his body rigid, a low vibration trembling in his chest, a growl that couldn't be heard, only felt. "Let them come," Silas said quietly, picking up his carving knife. The steel glinted in the gray light. "They think they're coming for a cripple and a pet. They have no idea what's waiting for them. The storm that night didn't just arrive, it declared war on the Oregon coast. The wind screamed through the Douglas firs with a velocity that bent ancient trunks like saplings, and the rain hammered against the tin roof of the cabin with the deafening rhythm of machine gun fire. Inside, the single bulb hanging over the kitchen table flickered once, twice, and then surrendered to the dark. The cabin was plunged into an abyss of shadow. The hum of the refrigerator died, leaving only the roar of the gale outside. Silas Vance didn't move. He sat in his armchair, his remaining hand resting on the armrest, his breathing steady. Most men would have fumbled for a flashlight or cursed the power grid. Silas did neither. He simply closed his eyes and let his pupils dilate, shifting gears from civilian to soldier. Darkness, after all, was just another terrain to navigate. But then the atmosphere in the room changed. It wasn't a sound, it was a pressure shift. Titan, who had been sleeping near the stove, stood up. He didn't scramble or shake himself off. He rose with a fluid, liquid grace that made no noise against the floorboards. He turned his massive head toward the back door, the one facing the blind spot of the cliffs. Silas watched the silhouette of the dog. Titan's body was rigid, a statue carved from the night itself. The fur along his spine stood up in a jagged ridge, and his ears were pinned flat against his skull. His lips curled back, exposing white teeth that glinted in the brief flash of lightning, but no sound came out. No growl, no bark, no whine. It was a silence more terrifying than any noise. Silas felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. He knew dogs. He knew that a scared dog barks to warn the pack. An aggressive dog growls to threaten the enemy. But a silent dog? A silent dog is a predator that has already decided to kill. "Close?" Silas whispered, the word barely audible. Titan didn't look back. He took one slow step backward, lowering his center of gravity, coiling his muscles like a loaded spring. Silas understood. If the threat were miles away, Titan would be pacing. If they were in the yard, he would be at the window. But he was backing up. That meant they were already on the porch. Silas moved. He slid out of the chair, dropping to a crouch. His knees protested, but he ignored the ache. He couldn't use the shotgun. The recoil with one arm would dislocate his shoulder, and in close quarters the barrel was too long to maneuver. He needed something intimate. He reached to his belt and unsheathed his carving knife. It wasn't a combat blade, but the steel was high carbon, and he had sharpened it to a razor's edge just that morning. "On me," Silas breathed. Titan vanished. He didn't leave the room. He simply stepped into the deepest shadow behind the wood stove and melded with the darkness. His black coat made him invisible. He became a void in the room. From the back door there was a sound that didn't belong to the storm, the distinct metallic scritch of a lockpick raking against tumblers. Then the heavy deadbolt slid back with a clack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The door creaked open. The wind rushed in, carrying the smell of wet ozone, mud, and something else, cheap tobacco and gun oil. A beam of light cut through the gloom. It was a tactical light, mounted on the barrel of a rifle. It swept across the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Then another light joined it. Then a third. 3 men, heavy boots crunching on the floorboards. They moved with a confidence that spoke of arrogance, not training. They assumed the house was occupied by a cripple and a traumatized pet. They expected fear. They expected begging. They didn't expect a master chief who had memorized every creak of his floorboards. Silas pressed his back against the wall of the pantry, the knife held in a reverse grip in his left hand. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate until he was nothing more than a part of the house's architecture. He counted the footsteps. 1, 2, 3. The first man moved past the pantry, his light sweeping the living room. "Clear right," a voice muttered, rough and edgy. "Check the bedroom," another whispered. "Find the old man. Make it quick." The second man moved forward, stepping into the space Silas had just vacated in his mind. Silas didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the shadow, moving not with the speed of a young man, but with the ruthless efficiency of an old one. He grabbed the second man's collar with his stump, using the leverage to jerk him backward, while his left hand drove the handle of the heavy knife into the man's kidney. It wasn't a lethal blow. Silas needed chaos, not a corpse, not yet. But it was agonizing. The man buckled, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Contact!" the first man shouted, spinning around. His flashlight beam swung wildly, painting streaks of white across the walls. Silas was already moving. He kicked the legs out from under the gasping man and rolled over the kitchen table, putting the heavy oak furniture between him and the shooter. A spray of bullets tore through the room, shattering the mason jars on the counter. Glass exploded, raining down like diamonds. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. "Where is he?" the third man screamed, panic rising in his voice. "I can't see him." Silas crouched behind the overturned table, glass shards digging into his knees. He was outnumbered. He was outgunned. He had one good arm and a knife against automatic weapons. The odds were impossible, but the intruders had made a fatal error. They were looking for a man. They had forgotten about the shadow behind the stove. In the brief pause between bursts of fire, Silas looked across the room. He couldn't see Titan, but he felt him. The air in the corner was charged with a kinetic energy, a coiled violence, waiting for the command. The silence from that corner was heavier than the storm outside. "Come on," Silas whispered through gritted teeth, gripping his knife until his knuckles turned white. "Welcome to the jungle, boys." The leader of the group signaled the others to spread out. They stepped over the broken glass, their boots crunching, closing the net around the table. They thought they had him trapped. They thought the silence in the room was the silence of surrender. They were wrong. It was the silence before the roar. The raid had devolved into a chaotic symphony of breaking glass and shouting men, but now it distilled down to a singular, terrifying moment of clarity. Silas was backed against the heavy oak cabinets, his chest heaving, his left hand gripping the carving knife so tight his knuckles were white. He was an old wolf, cornered by hyenas. The two men he had disabled were groaning on the floor, but the third man, the leader, was still standing. He was a giant, wearing a tactical vest that looked stolen and eyes that looked empty. He stepped over the wreckage of the kitchen table, leveling a matte black assault rifle directly at Silas's chest. "You're done, old man," the leader spat, his voice distorted by adrenaline. "Drop the knife." Silas looked at the barrel of the gun. It was a black tunnel, the last thing he would ever see. He calculated the distance. 10 feet. Too far to lunge. He calculated his options. None. Silas Vance, Master Chief, Navy SEAL, didn't beg. He didn't plead. He simply straightened his spine, exhaled a long breath, and tightened his grip on the knife. If he was going out, he was going out standing. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, listening to the rain hammering the roof one last time. "It's a good night to die," he thought. The leader's finger tightened on the trigger. The metallic click of the safety disengaging echoed in the sudden silence, but the shot never came. From the top of the refrigerator, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. Titan had scrambled up there during the confusion, waiting in the high ground, silent as smoke, patient as death. He didn't growl to warn the man. He didn't bark to announce his attack. He simply launched. He was 80 pounds of muscle and kinetic energy, falling from the sky like a gavel of judgment. Titan hit the leader's outstretched arm with the force of a sledgehammer. His jaws clamped onto the man's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone-meeting teeth. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the floorboards, the muzzle flash illuminating the room in a strobe of blue-white light. The leader screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony, and collapsed under the weight of the dog. Titan rode him to the ground, but he didn't stop there. He planted his paws on the man's chest, pinning him to the hardwood. The man thrashed, reaching for a backup pistol in his belt. And then it happened. Titan threw his head back, his chest expanding like a bellows, and unleashed a sound that shattered the atmosphere of the room. Roar. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was a roar. It was a primal, vibrating thunderclap that seemed to rise from the center of the earth. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of 2 years of silence, trauma, and repressed rage exploding in a single, terrifying note. It shook the window panes. It froze the blood of every man in the room. It was the voice of a god of war reclaiming his battlefield. The leader froze, paralyzed by a terror deeper than physical pain. He stared up into the amber eyes of the beast standing over him, and he saw his own death. The roar snapped Silas out of his trance. The adrenaline that flooded his system wasn't fear anymore. It was pure, cold, tactical precision. "Titan, hold!" Silas shouted, his voice cracking with command. The dog froze, his jaws hovering inches from the man's throat, a low rumble still vibrating in his chest like an idling engine. Silas stepped forward. He didn't run. He walked with the terrifying calmness of an executioner. He kicked the pistol away from the leader's reaching hand. Then, with a fluid motion, he dropped his knee onto the man's chest, right beside Titan's paw. He pressed the cold steel of the carving knife against the man's jugular. "You came to my house," Silas whispered, leaning close enough that the man could smell the old coffee and violence on his breath. You threatened my family." The leader whimpered, his eyes darting between the one-armed man and the roaring beast. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the desperate pleading of a child. "Please," the man choked out. "Please." Silas looked at Titan. The dog was panting, his eyes bright and clear, the ghost of the trauma gone. He looked back at Silas, waiting for the order. Kill or release? Silas took a deep breath, the rage slowly receding, leaving behind the cold discipline of the SEAL he used to be. "You're lucky," Silas said, pulling the knife back an inch. "My partner is a professional." Outside, the storm was finally breaking. Through the shattered window, the red and blue strobe of police lights cut through the rain, painting the wet trees in erratic flashes. The sound of sirens wailed up the canyon road, followed by the crunch of heavy tires on gravel. Lucas kicked the front door open a moment later, his service weapon drawn, flanked by 2 state troopers. "Silas, police." He stopped. The troopers lowered their weapons, stunned by the tableau before them. In the center of the wrecked kitchen, amidst broken glass and overturned furniture, the one-armed old man sat on the chest of a weeping criminal, and standing over them both, head high and chest heaving, was the black dog. Titan looked at Lucas. He didn't shrink away. He didn't hide. He gave a single, short bark, sharp, clear, and loud. It was the sound of a soldier reporting for duty. The silence was over. The sun rose over the Oregon tree line, piercing the lingering mist with shafts of pale, clean light. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving the world washed clean. The air smelled of wet pine and ozone, the distinct fragrance of a new beginning. On the porch of the cabin, the wreckage of the night before had been cleared away. Silas sat on the top step, a white bandage wrapped tightly around his forearm where a shard of glass had grazed him. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a fortress that had weathered a siege. Titan lay beside him, his black fur drying in the morning sun. He was meticulously licking the soot and dried blood from Silas's remaining hand, a gesture of tenderness that seemed impossible for a creature that had roared like a demon only hours ago. The dog worked with a gentle focus, tending to the man who had stood beside him in the dark. Lucas leaned against the railing, watching them. He looked at his uncle, really looked at him, and saw that the gray pallor of grief was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady fire. "You took a hell of a risk, Uncle Si," Lucas said softly, breaking the morning silence. 3 armed men, 1 arm, no backup. Were you scared? Silas rested his hand on Titan's head, feeling the solid warmth of the animal's skull. He looked out at the ocean, calm and blue in the distance, and shook his head slowly. "No," Silas answered, his voice rough with emotion. "I wasn't scared, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone." As Silas stroked the dog's fur, a profound truth settled over him, heavy and comforting. He realized then that sometimes the most desperate prayers we whisper into the dark aren't answered with a flash of lightning or a booming voice from the clouds. God often chooses to answer us in quieter ways. He sends a warm heartbeat to lie at our feet when the nights get too cold. He sends a pair of amber eyes that see our pain without judgment and understand our silence without words. He sends a presence that refuses to leave, even when we try to push it away. Titan wasn't just a rescue from a shelter, and he wasn't just a discarded weapon of war. He was a messenger disguised in scarred skin and black fur. When Silas looked into those eyes, he didn't see a wild animal. He saw the hand of God gently stitching the torn edges of his own soul back together. It turned out that guardian angels don't always have white wings. Sometimes they have 4 paws, a wagging tail, and a loyalty so fierce it can chase away the nightmares. Silas hadn't saved Titan from that cage. God had used Titan to save Silas from the eternal winter in his heart. 3 months later, the Oregon mist finally retreated, revealing a coastline painted in vibrant greens and deep, endless blues. The air on the gray cliff no longer smelled of damp rot. It smelled of salt spray, wild sage, and fresh cedar. In the center of the cabin's living room, the block of wood that had once frustrated Silas was finished. It was an eagle in mid-dive, talons outstretched. It wasn't smooth or polished like a factory-made ornament. The wings bore the rough, distinct gouges of a hand chisel, and the surface was textured, uneven, and raw. But it was powerful. It carried the story of the struggle it took to create it. It was imperfect, just like the man who carved it, and that made it a masterpiece. Silas wasn't home to admire it, though. He and Titan were down in the valley at the community center. They had started a program on Tuesdays. No fancy name, just coffee and chairs. Veterans from across the county, men and women with shaking hands, 1,000-yard stares, and prosthetic limbs, gathered there, and walking among them was the one-armed Master Chief and the mute Black Shepherd. Titan moved from person to person, resting his heavy head on a trembling knee here, leaning his weight against a sobbing shoulder there. He absorbed their grief with the same stoic silence that had saved Silas. He didn't need to bark to tell them they were safe. His presence was the promise. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Pacific horizon, setting the ocean on fire with gold and violet light, Silas, Lucas, and Titan sat on the cabin porch. Lucas held a mug of coffee, watching his uncle scratch Titan behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped a slow, contented rhythm against the floorboards, a sound that had become the heartbeat of the house. "You know," Lucas said quietly, looking out at the waves, "I used to worry about you up here. I thought you were just waiting to die." Silas smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I was," he admitted, "but I got interrupted." Lucas looked at the trio they formed. A young ranger, an old soldier with one arm, and a dog with no voice. It wasn't the picture of a family found in storybooks. There was no white picket fence, no minivan, no conventional wholeness. But as the wind chimes sang in the breeze, Lucas realized a profound truth. Family isn't defined by the number of chairs around a dinner table, nor is it defined by bloodlines or marriage certificates. Family is defined by the amount of love that fills the empty spaces in a home. Silas was no longer a widow guarding a fortress of solitude. He was the patriarch of a small, fierce clan of survivors. Titan wasn't a pet. He was the glue that held the jagged pieces together. They had redefined what it meant to belong. They proved that broken things don't have to be fixed to be valuable. Sometimes they just need to be held together until they heal in a new shape. "We're home, Titan," Silas whispered, looking at the horizon. "We're finally home." Titan let out a soft huff of air and closed his eyes, the warmth of the setting sun on his face, surrounded by the only pack that mattered. Life can break us in 1,000 ways. It can take our limbs, our loved ones, and our voices. But as Silas and Titan showed us, it can never take our capacity to love again. If we are brave enough to let someone in, even if it's just a dog with a scarred soul, we might find that our greatest purpose waits for us on the other side of our pain. If this story reminded you that no one is ever truly too broken to be loved, please share it with a friend who needs hope today. And if you believe that God sends His best angels with paws and fur, leave a Amen in the comments below. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for watching. May you find your own Titan, and may you always find your way home.